Okay, welcome to today's class, everybody. Because it's still me, Victor Peter, and today we'll be talking we'll recap on what we talked about when we had the topic JavaScript functions. Then we'll go in depth and talk about functions, then talk about callback functions. Then after that, we're also going to talk about promises, an introduction to promises, and we'll see how to or why promises came in the first place, and then how to write promises in JavaScript and also consume them or use them. Okay, so first, what is a function, right? I remember I remember clearly, I think I said in the class we had for functions that a function is a piece of or is a block of code that is callable, that can accept an argument, return a value, and it's callable. When I mean callable, you can call that function where you need it actually. Okay, and we saw that there's a way you write a function, you can and pass parameters and then call it. Okay. And then why do we need functions in the first place in a program? So you don't want your program to just run from top to bottom in a linear fashion, right? You want it to be that you can call a block of code or some certain statements, right? At the time you need them, you just call it, and then function promotes what is called reusability. So what is reusability? The ability for you to reuse a particular piece of code a couple of times, right? So if you look at it, there is this principle called dry principle in programming. So dry just is an acronym. It means don't repeat yourself. So when you're writing a program, you try as much as possible not to write the same thing twice, right? Instead of writing the same thing twice, you write it one place and you can call it twice, right? And when you see that what you're calling or what you're writing that you want to reuse is going to should react in different ways based on maybe the parameters that are passed to it, then you can write it as a function that accepts parameters and then returns results based on whatever parameter is passed to it or argument passed to it. And we will understand all these things I'm saying when we start writing functions. So then we also talk a little bit about arrow functions, if I remember. If we didn't talk about it, then arrow functions are just still like normal functions, right? But then an arrow function doesn't have a name specifically. It doesn't have a name. And then there is an effect it has when you're trying to use this with it, as far as I can remember. But the basic thing to know is that an arrow function is always going to be anonymous, except you pass it to a variable as a value. So that's why we now say if like the function or a variable can equals to the function, right? And some people also even say that a function is a data type. I've seen articles where people said the function is a data type. Okay. So an arrow function is a special kind of function that there are also functions called anonymous functions. Okay. And you can write your normal function to also be anonymous, right? But then you can also name your function. So an anonymous function is just simply a function that doesn't have its own name. So it might be assigned to a variable, or it might be passed to a callback, because so once you write a callback function, that function is always going to be anonymous, right? It's not going to have a name. Okay, so and then arrow functions are by default anonymous, except you pass it as a value to a variable, right? So Then the other thing we want to talk about today is promises. So what is a promise, right? So let's relate promise to a real life scenario. When let me use our uncles, right? So your uncle tells you, or probably, let's not use your uncle, let's say our parents, they usually say, oh, when you take first, right, I'll buy you so and so, um maybe this toy or this thing, right? They've made a promise to you. Now, does that promise stop you from doing any like doing when they make that promise to you, it doesn't stop you from like still working as a human being? You don't just wait till like stop all the activities in your life to wait until that promise is fulfilled before you continue doing what you're supposed to do, right? So that's the same way promises in JavaScript work. So now, before promises, right? JavaScript had this, should I say, blocking kind of structure, in the sense that while you're executing codes, right, and it's going line by line, and then it reaches a line that takes time to execute, your code can actually halt, and then waits on that particular line till it executes before it continues. And sometimes that's not the effect you want to have on your code. You want it that your code should be able to still continue to execute while that long running function or long running statement is still running. And then once the result of that long running statement is supplied, then you use that result to do whatever you want to do in your code, right? So that is possible using promises. So once you write a promise to JavaScript, you tell it, I promise this is going to happen, right? Then any other code that comes after that promise can still be executing while that promise is pending. So there are three states a promise usually is, right? Let's say three states of a promise. So a promise could be pending, a promise could be resolved, or a promise could be rejected. So when a promise is being executed, that promise at first is in its pending state. So pending in this, it means that it is not fulfilled yet, it's not rejected yet, it's just pending. So at that pending stage, the code inside the promise might be executing, and it hasn't reached a line where it's being resolved or rejected. So when it resolves, right? When the promise resolves, it returns the value that is desired, that it's supposed to return, right? It returns the result that was expected. But then when a promise gets rejected or returns a reject, then usually what you would send back in the reject is the reason that promise failed or that promise didn't execute properly. So you want to return that reason. Okay. Now, also, when you're consuming promises, you can consume it in different ways. That's when I mean consume, I mean after writing the promise, when you're calling it to get the result or checking it's rejected instead of resolved, right? There are different ways you can write it. You can write it using a denable function. You can also write it using async await, which of course you want to wrap in you wrap in a try and catch. Okay, and we will see how all these things work out when we start writing code. Okay, so I hope there's no question on what I've said so far, right? So in the absence of any question, let me share my VS Code, and then let's start executing some scripts. So let's come here. Let's see this. Now we have that a function is a piece of or a block of code that you can call and see. So let me just say, let me write something like this: console.log. Hello. This is a code. This a function we are calling, right? We are calling console.log, right? Console.log is written somewhere. Console is like an object that has the function name log. That is, it's global. So when we say global, it means it comes with Node.js. Anywhere you call it in your code, anywhere you call console.log in your code, you can actually its effects can be felt there. So let's see. Of course, you guys already know the result of this, right? But so if I said not script, it shows hello, beautiful. But how about if we wanted to call this function? Okay, let's take for example, I want to greet like I want to greet like 5 people that came to class. So I'd say hello, maybe hello Abdulatif, welcome to class. Let me greet like 2 people, right? Hello Excel. Hello Excel, welcome to class. Right? This is normal for us to write, right? It's normal for anybody to write. But of course, this doesn't um this doesn't adhere to the dry principle. Dry principle. I repeated myself here. I wrote console.log twice. I wrote it here. I wrote it here again. When it is possible for me to write the console.log once in a function, and then I can call that function, and I know that the only thing that changes if I'm trying to write a function is the name of the persons that I'm trying to reference while trying to greet them. So how do I solve that? I would want to write a function, and then this is a normal function that you want to write in JavaScript. So in every time you're writing a function, you would start it with the keyword function. Then after that, you write the name of the function. So the name of the function also adhere to the rules you use when you're naming your variable. I remember I talked about variable naming. How do you name your variable? I said that your variable can start with an underscore, can include an underscore, can start with a dollar symbol, can include a dollar symbol. It can start with a digit, but it can include a digit. It can't contain special characters, and it can't contain space. So the same rules you use to name your variable, you also use the same rules to name your function. So let's say I want to say hello guys. I'll say maybe I want to name the function greeting. I would say greeting. Remember, I'm using camel case. I'll say maybe greet some people. Remember that this is like how camel case works. Or let me name it greet. Just greet, not greet some people. So do that. I just move that there. Maybe I'll just say hello and welcome to class. Hello and welcome to class, right? Of course, if I try to execute this code, nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to happen because we've written the code, but we didn't call it. We haven't called it. So this is how you call your code. You say the name, oh sorry, this is how you call your function down here in line 7. To call it, you write the name of the function, and then you pass in, or you put those curly, oh sorry, parentheses, and this parenthesis is empty because here is also empty. So if you execute it again, you see hello and welcome to class. But then I want to be able to greet people by their name. So that means I want to give parameters to this function. So, and what is a parameter, right? A parameter is just simply a value that you can pass to the function. right? A value you can pass to the function, in a named value that you can pass to the function. So what do I want to pass in? I want to pass in student's name here. So I'm giving the name of the parameter, which is student's name. So now we have student's name here. I would want to, when I'm calling greet, I want to pass the value of student's name, which is important actually. I will need to pass it. So I could say maybe greet Excel and greet Michael. Okay. So doing that is going to run the function twice. The first time, the value of student's name will be Excel, and the second time, the value of student's name is going to be Michael. Okay. And if you notice, this variable is just this argument. So what I wrote here is called an argument, right? It's called an sorry. What I wrote here is called a parameter, not an argument. This is a parameter. So this is the first parameter, right? And then here, this is the argument I'm passing. So this argument Excel, which is a value, would be mapped to this parameter. Okay, it will be mapped. This would be mapped to this Excel will be mapped to this parameter when this first line 7 runs. Then Michael will be mapped to student's name, or will be linked to student's name when line 8 is executed. But then this isn't going to change anything here, because we are not using student's name in our console.log. So how do we change that? How do we make student's name to show here? We can do this. We can put the comma there, and then we say hello, then we write student's name. So I know you guys are used to using plus, like concatenating, right? But if you don't want to concatenate, this is another way to write your maybe log out things, right? To log out maybe a string or a value. Okay, so if you have like two values, irrespective of what kind of value you have, right, it is going to log it out one by one. So let's execute this, and then let's see how it is going to show up. So if we do that, we see hello Excel and welcome to class, then hello Michael and welcome to class. Okay. So Maxwell, you're asking, can syntax be used in this situation? So when you say can syntax be used, what do you mean by syntax? So whatever you're writing, right? Whatever you're writing in programming is actually a syntax. Like what you're writing here, everything you're writing here is a syntax, but they have different names. This is a function, this is calling the function, this is a value, this is a parameter, but everything is a syntax actually. Okay, so someone is saying I should try and use a backtick. So if I'm using a backtick, this is what I would want to do, right? Okay, so I would remove the quotes here, and I'll remove the quotes here at the beginning and at the end. Then I'll remove everywhere that there's quotes inside. Okay, I'll remove the comma. In fact, let me just take it back to how it was before. Okay, so this is how it looked. But now I don't have quotes at the beginning, at the end. Rather, I have backticks at the beginning and at the end. So I want to add student's name here. So what I'll do is hello, then I'll put a dollar symbol, bracket open, bracket close. Then I'll write student's name. So what is going to happen is it is going to, at runtime, replace the value of student name with Excel once line 7 is being executed. Then once line 8 is being executed, it will replace student name with Michael. Okay. So if we do that, we clear here. I think I should make this bigger. Okay. So if I do that and I run it here, you see, hello Excel and welcome to class. Hello Michael and welcome to class. Exactly the same way it worked before. Okay. So and you can concatenate, you can use comma to separate the values you want to be logged out. You can also use in string interpolation, template literals and interpolation to log out things or to log out value. Okay. And even if you did this, something like greeting, const greeting equals to that, and then you said console.log greeting, to still give you the same results. So one thing to note in programming is that there are different ways you can achieve the same results, but out of those different ways, is a best way to do it, or the best practice is usually called best practice. A best practice to approach that that problem, right? And there's also a way that is not really good, or should I say not popularly accepted, because it's not a proper way to solve the problem. So sometimes it might actually solve a problem in programming, but solving it might also create another problem. So like in this case, it's not, to me, it's not necessary to assign another variable here and log out the variable here. Since you know what exactly you want to log out, you can just log out what you want to log out rather than do this. Okay, so we've seen that we can pass in parameters, but then as a programmer, right, you also want to look at cases where, so what if this person did not call Michael here and the person just called greet like that? What will happen? It's now showing, so the first one is hello Excel and welcome to class. The second one is hello undefined and welcome to class. Okay, undefined and null are actually they're actually data types. And so let me explain the null data type. Now, you notice that you did not specify student's name here. So while calling this function and the value of student's name wasn't passed, it's going to be undefined. So any function, any variable you declare or parameter you pass without giving a value to that parameter, okay, or to that variable will be by default undefined. So if I just say let A, for example, maybe let me just let me say let A and then console.log A. It will actually be undefined. It will be undefined because you can't just declare a variable and the variable doesn't store anything. So it's going to by default store a data type called undefined, which signifies that it doesn't actually have any value. It's more like saying a bottle of water, after drinking the bottle is empty. Actually, to you, that bottle is empty, but a scientist will tell you that there's air inside that bottle, that as you're drinking out water, you are replacing the space where the water was with air. So when you cover the bottle and say it's empty, it's not actually empty, it's not a vacuum, there's air inside that bottle. So it's just the same scenario here. You said let A, but A is not actually empty. A is assigned to the value of undefined by default. So unless you give it a value, like your defined value, A will be undefined till this code crashes. Okay. So let's come back here. Now, there's what is called default parameter, right? There's what is called a default parameter. And what is a default parameter? A default parameter is just simply a parameter you pass to a function that if that parameter doesn't have a value, then it should use that value as its default value. So, for example, if you say student's name should be equals to guest, okay, then you come back here and say NodeScript.js. So you see that in this first instance, we said so in this first instance, we said that the student's name should be Excel, and it showed hello, Excel, and welcome to class. The second time, right, when we were calling this same function, we didn't pass a value to it, right? And the function now, what the function now does is, oh, since there's no value passed to it, instead of logging out define, then the default value of student's name should be equals to what? Guest. So that's why it's now showing hello guest and welcome to class. Okay. Then, so I hope, is there anybody that is lost at this point and maybe needs more explanation to what I've said so far? I hope everybody is following. If you're following, say I'm following. So I'll know you're actually following what I'm doing. Okay. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Right. So these are default values. And then there's something about default values. Okay. Default values should be specified last. So let me explain what I mean by last. If you have multiple values, okay, so let me say we have student's name, we have student's location, and then we have student's age, right? We have these three at the same time. Now, okay, so now when you say student's location, student's age, right? These last ones, right? So you can't do something like this. You can't say student's name is equals to by default guest, and then you probably leave these two, right? This one should be the one to get the default first before others. The last one, in fact, the ones at the end, the parameters at the end should be the ones that should get the values first, right? The default values first. And this is the reason. If you so how if you wanted to call these greetings and then you didn't want to pass student's name, but you wanted to pass student's location and student's age, how would you do it? You can't. If you did something like this, maybe you said empty, and then you now said comma. Okay, let's see if that will even work. So let's say student's location, welcome to class. Let me just say you're at you're at that location and you are that years old. Okay, so let's do this. Let's just say student's location is Canada. Student age is 22. So let me clear this, then try to run it again. Do you notice it's giving an empty, it's not using the guests, for example, but the Canada and the 22 years old is actually working. Okay. So I'm seeing, let me use null. Let's see what it's going to do. Okay, it now come okay, it's just it uses null here. Let me try undefined. Okay, so if you purposely pass undefined here, right, that's when it is going to use it. That's when it is going to now say, okay, since it's undefined, you're passing here, then you should use guest. But this is not encouraged actually, like passing undefined purposely, right, to functions. Rather, you can give all of them a default um value, or at least the last ones, like maybe student's age, student's location and age, or you can give all of them at the same time a default value, so that you wouldn't need to pass undefined here. Okay, and if you called if you call greet with just two parameters, it will map Canada to student's name and map the student's location to 22, which is not what you actually want. Okay. Right. So we could say student age should be equals to, maybe the default age should be 0. The default location should be Nigeria. Then maybe let's just remove this guest char. So now with this, if you just called only student's name, maybe Martins, right? The default location will be Nigeria and the default age, student age would be 0. So Martins, you're in Nigeria, your age is 0 years old, and all the stuff, right? Because we passed in default values here, okay? And you can also pass default values here, but my point is that anytime you want to pass default values, it would make more sense to pass the default values to the uh, um, the parameters at the end, right? That's like what is encouraged more. But if you still want to do it the other way, maybe you remove maybe all the defaults and you just have the one at the beginning alone. Maybe something like this. Maybe you just say guest here. Maybe something like this. So you know that student location, which means student location, you must always pass it every time. But student's name and age could be student's name and age could have a default parameter. You could do this, but then what if you're working with number? What if okay, for example, let's take for example that student's age came first before student's location, right? And you didn't give it a default value. Okay, let's say you gave it a default value, right? And then you have student location here. Maybe student location should be by default Nigeria. Mm, or let's just say these two didn't have a default. Let's just think about that scenario. These two didn't have a default, right? You pass Martins. How do you want to tell if the student's age should use the default of 0? How do you want to do that? Let me still try undefined. Let's see if it will work. Student location is Nigeria. Okay, okay. Yeah, it's Nigeria and your age is 0 years old. Okay, this also works. So this also works for numbers. Okay. So, but are you guys getting my point? My point is that if you're going to declare it first, it is not encouraged to pass undefined as the value of your parameter. It's not really, it's not encouraged to do it. Although you can do it, but it's not really encouraged to do it. Okay, so you even if you have a like a default here, right? You won't see any you won't see any library that you would want, maybe you would want to use that would tell you to pass undefined as a parameter when you're calling that that library or a function in that library. I've not come across it before. So this is highly discouraged. Even if it is possible, you can do it. Like passing an undefined to a function, highly discouraged. Shouldn't do it. Okay. So Martins, you say I'm not following. Yes, I'm the only one, please. So Martins, at what points did you find it confusing? Okay, so Martins, you can type at the point where you found it confusing. You can just type it on the chat. Then I'll address that. So another person is asking, Johnson, you're asking, why not use comma instead of the interpolation, that it would give the same, will it give the same output? Yeah, yes. So this is it. If we did something like this, okay, then of course what you're going to do here is since this goes to a new line, you're going to escape, you're going to put a backslash. So this backslash is just telling JavaScript. So this line continues in the next line, like this string continues in the next line. So it will understand that, okay, this string is not just in one, like it's not only this line, maybe. So now if you don't put this, what JavaScript is going to be thinking is that this line 5 is a different statement on its own, while this line 4, you forgot to close the string there. That's what JavaScript is going to think, right? And try it to execute it that way. But if you now put the forward slash here, it will understand that this line 4 and line 5, this string actually stops here, right? So, okay. Okay, so if I used comma, so if I wanted to use comma, now notice that when I use comma, I don't really put space, right? So if I used, so I said, where is it? I don't really put space here after the hello because the comma, right, is going to automatically, so this comma is just going to automatically add space for me for this in between the variables I'm trying to log out. It's going to automatically add that space for me. We'll see that. And welcome to class. You're at and welcome. Okay, hello, student's name. Welcome to class. You're at move that student location, comma, then you are, close this here again. You can even put the comma here. H years old. Okay, so hello, student's name. Okay. student name, comma, and welcome to class. Okay. Okay, so this is only going to work. So let me cut this and put inside the console.log. Yeah. It works inside console.log, not when you're using it in a variable. So if we did this and then so you see that it still works perfectly well, still works well, right? But then someone is saying it's looking kind of messy. Yeah. So it's looking because we close and open the quotes, right? So it's going to look messy. So that's one of the reasons why we have like the normal string interpolation and template literals, which is something like this, right? Okay. And if you notice, it preserves our enter, the enter when we like taking the value to the next line, it actually preserves it doesn't ignore the enter, like going to the next line, right? It preserves that. Let's see if I add more spaces here and I try to execute it. It also preserves that space, okay? But if we were using quotes, it's going to, so let me just change this to quotes alone. I know that this is not going to print exactly the way we want it to print, but then I just want to use it to demonstrate something. You see, the okay, it preserves the space. Okay, but our enter, it doesn't take it to the next line, but it just adds space here. Okay, so that's one key difference between using normal string and then using backticks. Backticks will make it look exactly the way you specify it. This space here, this space you're finding here is from here, actually. Okay. See, that space is no longer there again because I removed it. So this using string is going to preserve your space, but it's not going to preserve your next line statement, except you interpolate it. You use string interpolation. So doing it like this. Okay. I think this is because I didn't. Okay, because of this that symbol there. Because of that symbol, I guess even if I remove it, let's see, it still goes to the next line. Still goes to the next line. It's assuming this hello starts from the same line. Okay. So if I added that space now, it will also take into account that space I just added here. Okay, so is there any question? Does anybody have any question? All right, so let me make this more simple, right? Let me take it back to how it was before. So Martins, I hope, are you there? Are you there? Can you see my screen? Martins. Oh, Martins, I hope you're part of the call. You can see my screen. So anyways, going over it, let me just go over it again. Okay. Hope other people, can you see my screen? Who is not seeing my screen? Okay, every other person is seeing my screen. So Martins, I guess that would be an issue with your own network because every other person is seeing my screen. Every other person is seeing my screen. Okay. So once the video goes on YouTube, you can rewatch it. You can rewatch it actually. Sorry for the network issue at your end. Right. So let's move on. Let's move on. Let's move on. So we have hello students and welcome to class. Okay. Then now let's see. We can actually return values, right? So now why do we even need to return values in function? Okay. Now remember that a function is a piece of code that you're sending message. a piece of code that you are trying to execute, and then you're trying to get a result from it. Now, what we've written so far, right? This is what we've written so far. Just so what we did is we created the function, the variable name greetings. We assign it to hello. Then we know that this student's name is just a placeholder for the student's name, right? And then we now say and welcome to class, right? And then the next thing we are doing is we are logging out this code. We are logging out the we are logging out that greetings, right? And this is just saying show it on the terminal. Now, where that code, now this place this code is being called doesn't receive a value. In fact, it receives a value of undefined. So if we do something like this, if we said console.log, const results should be equals to greetings, and then we try to log out results. Okay. Have you noticed something? Now, we call the function, but the function is logging out something, but it's not returning a result. Now, when you're writing your code, maybe your back-end code or something, it's not logging out results that you want to be doing, right? You want to be able to pick the result from a function and maybe send it to a user, like send it to the front end, if it's the front end that is querying you, or send it to an API. Okay, so console.log for us is just showing us the results now, but people are not going to be coming to the terminal on your server to be checking the result because your console.logging things, right? You want it that when people interact with your API can return something to them, and they can now decide what they want to use the result of your API to do, whether to log it out, whether to save it, whether to do whatever they want to do, right? So that starts with what you're going to write in your function. How do you write your function that should return a value? Okay. So if you want to do that, we will do that using the return statement. Okay. You'll do that by wrapping your function in a return statement. Now, when you do this, what you're trying to say is when you call greet and you pass in student's name, it will form this string with the student's name being here. Then it should return that as the result of calling this function. So when you call this function, what it will return is the result greet. Sorry, it will return the result of calling greet, and the result of calling greet will be hello, student name, then it will now be and welcome to class. So now when we return that, when this function returns that value, we can decide what we want to do with that value. We can decide to log out that value. We can decide to send that value to a database. We can decide to email that value to a user. or do something. There are a lot of things we can do with that. Okay, and this is another reason for writing functions that should return values, because you might want to also pass the value that function has returned to another function. You get, you might write a function, and then the result of that function you want to pass to another function to do something else. So that's that's like scenarios that would require that, okay, a function should return something so that you can use it somewhere else. Okay, beautiful. So if we do this, and then we clear our terminal and come and run node and script again, you'll see something. You see, hello Martins and welcome to class. Now, this is because this result now has something that was being returned to it. If we did not return anything in this function, right, result would be undefined and we'll be logging out only undefined. Does it make sense to you guys? Is anybody that is confused at this point? Does it make sense? If you're following, right, I'm following. Let me be sure that you're actually following. Okay. So someone is saying he is confused. Okay, so let me write two functions. I think this would be practical for me to write to show if I'm writing two functions. So let me write two functions. Let me write another function to let me just write a function to let me write a function to log out what you just did. Maybe I'll see something like log out something. Log out something. And I want to pass in a value here, and then yeah, I understand. So you said that first we're logging out, but now we are returning. So you don't understand why I'm doing that. So I'll explain that now. So I'll then say console.log value. Of course. So I've written two functions. One is returning a value, and then the other one is just logging out something. But now what I want to do is I want to call this greet function. And once this greet function executes, I want to pass it to another function to log out something. Okay. So now, how do I do that? First, I've called greet function. I've called greet function. Now, see, let me just clear this and call this function. Do you notice that nothing prints out? Have you noticed? You notice that I called greet, but since I'm returning something from greet, right? I'm returning something from the greet function. But then what I'm returning from the greet function is saved in results. But then I've not logged it out, I've not done anything. But I want to pass the value of this result to another function. Entirely. So for me to do that, I now wrote another function that I can use to log out something. So for me, if I want to log out now, I could do something like this. I'll say log out something, and what do I want to log out? Results. So if I clear this and run it again, I'll just say, let me just do something like this. The value you're logging out. So do you guys understand what is happening here? So first, I called greet. Okay, so someone is asking, apart from return, if there is no other keyword to use. No, there's no other keyword to. If you're returning something from a function, you're always going to use return to mark that that is what you're returning. Okay. No, this is not really like a callback because it's not as if you're passing this function to the log out something. You're passing the result of this function to log out something. You're not passing the function itself to log out something. Okay, so what we just did here is first we wrote two functions, one that returns a value and one that just logs out what we are doing. So we call the first function with an argument, and when that function returns a result, we call the next function and pass the results of the first function to the second one. Does it make sense to you guys now? So you see, if I didn't write it this way, right? If I didn't write it this way, then probably, and I didn't want to log out anything here, right? Then I wouldn't be able to access maybe what I'm looking for. So in this grid now, what I did was, now this is just an example. I could write some expressions here or some statements, write a whole lot of statements here, and then maybe the statement does mathematics or calculation or something, and then I return the result of those whole calculation at the end. Okay, so I hope you guys are following. Is there anybody that is confused about how the return actually works? Or do you guys follow? If you're following, say I follow. If you're not following, say I don't follow. So Johnson, are you following? Are you following? Martins, is it still confusing to you? Is this one confusing to you? Or you're following? So to recap again, let me go over it. First, I have a function that now in JavaScript, popularly, right? We could refer to this function as a utility function. Okay, because this function just does one thing. It accepts a name and it returns back a greeting. So I can call this function a couple of times. Okay, I can call this function a couple of times, right? And then when the result comes from this function, I can pass it to another function. I can decide what I want to use that result to do. Now, what I'm simply doing here is I am leaving the decision of what to use the value of the of this function or the value this function returns to the caller. I'm not, so this function doesn't decide what it's going to do with the value. It just returns the value to whoever called it or to wherever it was called, so that that value can be used to do something else. Okay. So I could write a function that maybe, let me write another function here. Capitalize value. So I say that this function would accept a value also and should console.log the capital version. So I'll say value when capitalized looks like this. So local uppercase. When capitalized looks like this or will look like this. Now, let me call it again. I'll say, so I'll call this new function here. Let me clear this and call it again. So have you noticed this? So whatever I want to use this result to do, I can access the result of this function, okay? Whatever I want to use the result of this greet function to do, as far as I've saved it here, I can pass it to 5 other functions to do whatever I want at any time. I can pass the result of this greet to 20 functions. You do this with it, you do this with it, you do whatever I want to do with it, you do this, right? So I'm not leaving the decision of what to use this hello to do to this greet function. I'm just saying once I call you, just return back this to me. Whatever I want, like return it with the student's name included with the string. Then whatever me as the caller I want to do with the result of this function, I can do with it. I can log it out, I can change it to capital, I can pass it to another function. Okay, I hope that is clear enough at this point. Hope everybody is following. Okay, is there anybody that doesn't understand or is not following? Anybody? Okay. All right, so in case you don't understand it, you can like rewatch the video. So I'm passing here, right? I'm passing here, I'm going down. So let's continue. So what's the next thing I want to talk about? Callback functions. So what is a callback function? Now, if you notice what I did up here, I called this function and I returned a value, and then I'm using it in another function. But what if I made it in a way that I can call this first function and then pass in this function, this capitalized function value, into this function as a parameter, and we know that we can do whatever I want to do inside that parameter. I'll explain this when we write the function, right? So now what I'll do is I'll write this greet function again, and then I'm going to pass this capitalized value as a parameter to this greet function, and then see how we can capitalize the value once greet is being called. So instead of having two functions like this, right? Now, what does callback functions or functions that accept callback allow us to do? They allow us to specify a function, our function, as a value to another function. So, and our function will be called after the value of the parent function is being executed. So this plenty English I'm talking about, let us write it in code. So let's call greet again. So I'll say function greet. Call greet this way. I'll say student name and a callback. Student name and callback. Notice that student name is a normal variable, callback is also a normal variable. So this is what I will do. I'll then come and say, I'll say let's greet equals to, or let's this is another thing. I can't name this greet again. I can't name this greet. Greet is used as the function name. Greet can also be used as a variable name inside here. It's not actually it shouldn't, unless maybe I want to change this to capital G. So I know that these two are actually different. So I could say let's say callback value should be equals to, I'll just come here and copy what I wrote already. Okay, so I'll say the callback value should be that. Okay, so what I'm saying here is, once you pass student's name and a callback function, you do what you're supposed to do with the student's name. Then inside this same function, you are going to call that callback function and pass the value of this callback value to the callback function. So that when the user wants to now supply values, he can supply a callback as a value when he's calling this greet function. This one will confuse you small, but don't panic. So now, this is how you will do it, right? After when you've done the manipulation, now instead of returning the value of or this callback value, instead of returning it, maybe writing a return, maybe something like this, return callback value. Instead of writing return callback value, this would work, right? Maybe then the same thing we did up there, right? You can do it here. Then you now say maybe result equals to greet. So once it executes and greet executes, the callback value will be saved. Or sorry, the return value will be saved. Maybe something like this. Let array result should equals to greet. Of course, what is going to happen is what I wrote up, the function will be called, right? And then once the function is called, the value will be recorded in results. Then you can use it to do whatever you want to do. But I want the user to be able to specify a function that should do whatever he wants to do there. So this is how I'll do it. Instead of writing this, instead of returning it, I'll then write callback. I'll call the callback inside this function. And then inside the callback, I'll pass in the value I want to give that callback. So I'll call it callback, this callback value. So what I've done is I've manipulated what I want to manipulate here. I've done what I want to do, my resolving whatever I want to resolve. Then after that, I assign it to a variable and I pass that variable to the callback. So once you specify this function and then you pass a student name and a callback, as it's executing this function, it is also going to call this callback automatically. As it's executing the greet function, it will call the callback which you're going to pass here. Does it make sense to you guys? Is it confusing? I hope you guys are following. I hope it's not confusing at this point. Okay. So let me just stop sharing and share again. I don't know why some people can't actually see my screen at this point. So let me share again. Okay, so if you're not following up to this point, I don't really expect that, or I expect that you should follow, but if you're not following, it doesn't actually mean that you're not sharp or you're not getting it, right? You need to practice callbacks to understand it. So someone is asking, but can the callback be an actual function that performs a certain task? Of course, the callback is going to be a function that we are going to call, and we are going to call it. What we have done is we are just declaring the function greet and calling the callback inside the greet function. Finish. You can call this, now this callback I wrote here, it's not by must you call it callback. You can call it CB. You can call it anything you want to call it. But at the end of the day, if you're using CB, after when you've done your manipulation, now call it like this, CB. If you're naming it as callback, you still call it as callback. So what is going to happen is it's going to do whatever you wrote before the callback, then it will now call the callback. Okay. So let's write the callback finally. Let's write the function and then pass a callback to that function. So what is a callback function? A callback function is just simply a function that is passed to another function as a parameter. Remember that student name is a parameter and callback noun is also a parameter. So any function that is passed to another function as a parameter is called a callback function. It's that simple. So let's write a callback function. Okay. So let's do that. So we'll say greet, right? And then the first value you want to pass into greet is the student's name. So I'll say Christiana. Okay, so I'll pass in that name, Christiana, comma. The next function I'm going to pass there is going to be the callback function. So you can write it as this function, which is an anonymous function. So now this is a callback function, and a callback function can be your normal function or your arrow function. But notice that this function doesn't have a name. Greet has a name, function greet. This function doesn't actually have a name because this function is a value, or is a value that is going to be mapped to this callback here that you've written here. So once greet function is called, Christiana will be mapped to student's name. This function will be called callback. And of course, this function would be called inside the greet function automatically. So it's like saying, when you call greet, it is going to do this. Then it's going to, inside greet will now call this callback function. Okay. So now, this callback function, when it's being called, is given a value, which is a callback value. So now this callback value is an argument that is being passed here. So which means when I'm calling the function, I'm expecting it to have a parameter of callback value. So I could name this callback value whatever I want to name here. I could call it VAL. Let me just call it VAL. Then inside here, I want to console.log the value of VAL. I'll say I'll just say callback function value, comma, VAL. So if I do that and I come back and, okay, I don't need to clear my terminal and run NodeScript.js. Do you notice what is happening here? So what happens is when I call greet does this, right? Welcome, then it replaces student's name with Christiana. Then it calls the callback function, which we pass in as a parameter here. So once it calls the callback function, when you're calling greet, right, it does what it's supposed to do with Christiana, and the next thing it does, it calls the callback function, right? Is there anybody that is confused at this point? Anybody that is not following? Is there anybody that is not following? Is there anybody that is not following? Who is not following at this point? Okay, all right, fine. So only one person is following. The rest are actually confused. Am I lying? If you're confused, say I'm confused. Can anything represent that callback in the console? Can anything represent that callback in the console? I'm thinking about what you mean. Can anything be represented, or can it represent that callback function? Okay, are you talking about this one? Yeah, if you're talking of this is just like an ordinary variable, right? Or an ordinary parameter, but this parameter would be a callback based on how you're writing it, right? Now, you can pass in multiple. No, the callback didn't get fired first. The greet function got fired first. It's the greet function that is being executed that now calls the callback function. Do you get? I call greet first. So once I call greet, I pass in the parameters. Okay. So first and foremost, right? I just wrote the greet function and I passed in normal parameters. Of course, you know that normally it's just going to execute the parameters line by line. So it executes the first parameter and the second parameter. And it happens that the second parameter is a callback value. There is a callback function that accepts a value. Okay. So I now say greet and then passed the first. Now, it's not by must that it has to be a string and a callback. I can pass in multiple parameters. Okay, I can pass in, for example, I could pass in student's name, country. Okay, I can pass in student's name, country, and callback. So now when I'm calling it, I'll say Christiana, Nigeria, and that. I can decide to give you access to the country only in the callback function. So let's do that. If I didn't want to tamper with the callback value, I just wanted that once you pass the country, you can access the country in the callback value. I'll just write comma country. But now writing this automatically changes the way you call it. So say value and then, so this VAL here will map to this callback value, while this country will map to the second parameter I would call here. So I could say, I could call this second parameter country parameter. So I could console.log something here. You specified country as your country. So let me come back and clear the terminal and then run this again. So do you notice what is happening? So I called greet and I said that it's going to accept three parameters: a student's name, a country, and a callback function, right? And then I pass in country, Christiana as the student's name, country, Nigeria as the country, and then the callback function. Nice. Now, what I did is I didn't want to even touch this one at all. I didn't want to touch the callback value. I just said the same way you pass the country, just pass the country down here at once. Okay? Just pass the country from greet to the callback function so you can use it. Now, this callback function here, this first value, right? This first value you pass to the callback function is this, the value of this which you saved in this variable, while you pass country here. Now, when you're specifying your greet, you pass the first function and the first variable, which is this student's name. You pass the second variable, which is this country. Then in this function here, the first value of this callback function will be the first value when it's being called, while the second parameter here is going to be the second parameter you pass here. If you pass in 5 parameters to this callback function, you will pass 5 parameters here also. Okay? And it's not shy, it's not even by must. If I decide that I didn't even want to pass country, I know that callback has a callback value and a country. I can decide that I don't want to use country at all. I just want value like that. But of course, country parameter will now become, this country parameter here will now become undefined. Okay, so if I do that, let's say I clear it and I come back here and execute. It doesn't even, it's like, what is country parameter self? Where is country? Is not defined. But before that, it printed the first line. It printed this line here. It printed that line. And after printing it, it now tried to print this other line. So the country parameter is undefined. That's why it didn't work out. But then, if the country parameter is specified, and I clear this and come back here, you see, you specified Nigeria as your country. Country. This var here is whatever you pass here. Okay. I can just pass in, I can decide to pass a third parameter. I could say, you get it now. And then inside here, in this function, I just need to pass it as a third parameter. I'll just say my question. I can decide to do whatever I want to do. My question. Short and simple. Come here and clear this thing, the terminal. Then run that again. So you see, my question is, let me put those. Does it make sense to you guys? I hope who is following? If you're following, just say I am following, I'm following. Just write it, I'm following. Okay. So if you're not following up to this point, you need to rewatch the video. You necessarily need to rewatch the video so you would get the point I'm trying to make at here. You get that point. Okay. So let's yes, so you asked if it's being recorded. Yes, it's being recorded. Yes. Yes. So once it's time, you can, or once this video is posted, you can go and rewatch it if you didn't follow it, right? You can rewatch this. So callbacks are actually very, very necessary in JavaScript. They are very, very important in JavaScript. So you will see most times you might not really be writing the callback, but you will use it. You will use it when you're writing your JavaScript. In fact, when you're writing your back end, when you're writing your backend in JavaScript, right? This callback is what you'll be using. You'll be writing something like maybe response dot get, then you now say /, comma, then you now write the callback function. Callback function, you will have request, response, next, something like this, right? You pass in a route and then a function. Don't worry, when we start writing backend, you start writing these things and you get used to writing them or to using them. Okay. So now let's move over to promises and then we'll see how that works. Okay, so let me leave this out here and then let me continue. So I'll say promises here. So I said a promise is just is used to not block your activity or your program by allowing other things to still go on while your that promise is still executing on the background. Okay. All right. So how do we even write a promise in JavaScript? So we write a promise by using the new promise keyword. So we say const my promise. Okay, my promise should be equals to new promise. So this is how you write promises in JavaScript, right? You use the new keyword. You say you are creating a new promise. Okay. So this is how you write your promise in JavaScript. And then remember that I said that a promise is either pending, resolved, or rejected, right? So that means you now have to specify those two, or yeah, those two. A promise is by default pending. So you don't really need to say, oh, promise should be pending. So this promise keyword accepts a function. It accepts a function. So the function, you could use an arrow function. You can use an anonymous function that doesn't have a name. So we could just write function, then brackets that way. Or you can turn this to an arrow function. People like using arrow functions for it. Then this arrow function is going to accept two parameters, a resolve function and a reject function. So you call resolve, or resolve is called when you want to return what the promise has fulfilled, while reject is called when the promise rejects. It doesn't fulfill, it doesn't do what it was supposed to do. And most times when you call reject, you return the reason why that promise failed to the user. Okay, so once you do that, you can then say, so let me write a function that takes time to do something. So I'd say set time out. We set time out. So I want this to resolve after like 2 minutes. Okay. Or 2 seconds, not 2 minutes. Or let's say 5 seconds. I say not console.log. So I'll then write here that I want to resolve I've fulfilled my promise. I've fulfilled my promise. Okay. Then I want to show you guys something. Let me console.log other activities. I'm carrying out other activities. Okay. So this is how, forget about this line 46. This is how you write a promise, right? This is how you write a promise. You can resolve here. You can decide to reject, right? You can say, so I'll show how to reject, right, very soon. So, but this is how you write a basic promise that should resolve at every time. Then how do you actually start using this promise or consuming this promise? You can then, to consume this promise, you can then use the name of the promise, the name you named that promise, the variable where that promise is assigned to. You say, my promise dot, you can now use what is called denable functions. Denable functions. So you say dot den, right? So this then is what is going to be executed if this promise resolves. So you say dot then, and maybe you pass in an arrow function, right? Although, okay, so while I was talking, so this is a recap. While I was talking about functions, I didn't really mention callback functions. So a callback function is written like this, usually written like this, right? But then this callback, this arrow function doesn't have a name. So the only thing you could do to use this function is to assign it to a variable. So you could call it maybe const fn should be equals to that. And then when you want to call this function, You call it the normal way. You say fn like that. You call it this way. If you want to pass values to it, maybe var1 or parameter1, parameter1, parameter2, parameter2, you can pass in values this way. Maybe arguments 1, argument 1, comma, argument 2. You can pass it in that way. Okay? See? So that's how you do it. Okay? I think I should just allow it to remain here for you guys if you want to look at it. Yeah. So now, what you pass into this resolve promise is what will be passed into the parameter of this denable function. Okay? What you resolve is what is going to be passed here. What you reject is what is going to be passed into the catch statement. So I'm going to show you how the catch statement is being written. When you reject, you pass stuff to the catch statement. So I could say result here, just want to console.log the result and say result should be result. Okay. So if I execute this, do you notice something? I'm carrying out other activities, then you wait for some time, then you see that the result is I've fulfilled my promise. Do you notice? Now, what happened? We specified a promise here, and we even tried to use that promise before we wrote this. I'm carrying out my activities. But I'm carrying out my activity. Oh, okay. Matilda, I called this an arrow function. Okay? This is an arrow function. I guess that's what you're asking about. It's an arrow function. Oh, okay. What I call the den. So these are called denable functions. You could call it denable functions because they are enabled by the den keyword. This den keyword, denable functions. I call them denable functions. Okay. So denable functions are usually used to consume promises. Okay. So .den and then you console or log. So so you notice that this result, right, is the result of our resolve argument. Remember that this resolve is a function you're calling. Is a function you're calling. So when you specify a promise like this, it accepts a function that passes into arguments, and those two arguments too has to be a function which you call inside here. So you see, so my point was that even when we consume the promise, since this promise is long running, it's going to wait for 5 seconds before it executes. We call this I'm carrying out other activities. Like we continue our normal activity. Then later on, we now come back. Once the function executes, we log it out. Okay. But then what if you wanted this I'm carrying out my other activities to run after this result is being executed. That's after this result shows, then I'm carrying out my other activity should run. So if you want to do that, you will then drag this I'm carrying out my activities into the denable function. So if you do it like that and you clear this and then you run your node script, you notice that I'm carrying my other activities will wait until this one runs. So this one runs first, right? Before I'm carrying out my other activities, then runs the second. Okay, so this is how it works. So, but what if we reject? What if we return a reject after 5 seconds? Let's say we return a reject here. Okay, what if we return the reject there? Let's see. If we try to run this function, it will not run the then statement or the then block. It's going to wait, then it's going to say unhandled rejection. So now, why is it saying unhandled rejection? There is a reject too. Okay, so I've rejected or I've not fulfilled my promise, right? Now, why is it rejecting? Or why is it saying unhandled rejection? Your promise has rejected, but you're not handling that rejection. That's why we now say .catch. So this catch is like catch that unhandled reject. In fact, catch the rejection and tell, and then this catch also accepts a function, which is what also be going to be an anonymous function. So you then say catch, then you catch. Sorry, did I? Oh, sorry about this. Sorry, not here. So you can write .catch here. Say .catch, then can say the error, and you say console.log the error. So now, since we are rejecting, right? Since we are rejecting, whatever we are, when we are consuming this promise, the argument you pass to reject is the argument that will be given to the error or to the catch statement or to the function that you pass into the catch statement. Okay, so if we clear this again and then we run the script again, let's see. So it waits for 5 seconds and it tells you the error. Then this error, which is I have not fulfilled my promise. Have you seen that? So it rejects. So when you reject a promise, right? When you reject a promise, you want to call it this way or use it this way. Okay. So once you are rejecting, make sure you have a catch statement to catch the instance where that particular promise is being rejected. Then you use this then when it's resolving. So if I write this promise this way, right? If the promise fails, this is what it would be called. If the promise passes, this is the part that will be called, right? So then it's usually called when the promise is fulfilled, while catch is called when the promise rejects. Okay, do you guys understand up to that extent? Now, if you notice, so you notice that before this promise even executed, it waited for some times. It waited for some times. Now, that time that the promise was waiting, the promise was actually pending. The state of this promise was pending. Okay. So while the JavaScript sees that the promise was pending, any other thing that came under here that was not written in this promise will continue being executed until this promise now executes, or this promise now gets fulfilled or rejected. Then it will now come back and like show the result of that rejected promise. Okay. So does anybody have any question on what we've done so far? Any question? So if you don't want to use denable functions for this, then you can write your own function. Okay, so if a use case for this PI on your front end data from a database, right? What you're doing is you're actually sending you're sending a request to the to your database. The database sends you a promise, a pending promise that wait, oh, I'm going to send you data, just like I'm going to send, just wait, I'm still compiling your data. It sends a promise back of pending. Then once that data is prepared on your database, it then sends that data as a resolve to your back end. Then you can now use that data to do whatever you want to do. The same way when front end is trying to query an API, and it queries the API, the API doesn't, the API sends a promise. Look, I'm going to fulfill your what you've asked for, but just wait. Then it then does what it's supposed to do and then return the promise, that resolve the promise or either reject that promise. So that's like a one of the use case of promises when you're doing API calls to a different service or you're querying a database. What you're actually doing is you're consuming an API, you're consuming a promise. Okay. Matilda, I hope I've been able to answer your question.
I have a question.
You have a question?
Yes, sir.
Okay, what's your question?
Can we have the resolve and the reject at the same time? So that if you choose
No.
by itself, because it
Okay,
seems weird.
you can have the resolve and reject at the same time, but which means you have a condition where it resolves and a condition where it rejects, and the resolve and reject cannot be executed at the same time. One has to, once it executes resolve, it won't execute reject. Once it executes reject, it doesn't execute resolve. So maybe you might want to do something like if uh if A is even, if A divided by 2 is equals to 0, then maybe you would say it's even. Then you say it's even, else you want to reject that it's odd. Then maybe you say that, can even specify it out here. You say let A equals to 20. So it's going to wait for 5 seconds and then it's going to resolve that it's okay, sorry. So let me change this to 2. Wait for 2 seconds, then it tells you that it's even, and then it's carrying out other activities. So the resolve was the one that was executed. But then what if we're checking for like 21? We run it again, and then it tells you that there's an error, which is it's odd. Okay. Have I answered your question?
Yes, sir. Wait,
Okay.
I have one slight question. In that
Okay.
if statement, can we use ternary operation? Because the resolve and the I don't like to affect it.
Yeah, okay, I understand what you mean. So what you're asking for is we could do, so if we are doing that, this is what you mean. Yeah, let's execute this. Let me change this back to 20. So it works. So if we say 21, it also works. It's odd. So yes, you can use ternary operator. Have I answered your
Okay.
question?
Yes, sir.
Okay, beautiful. So another way you can use this is my promise is by writing using async await, and I'm sure you guys must have seen that. So let me leave that here and comment them. So that my promise, I want to use async await to consume it. So, but of course, you always wrap your async await. You wrap your function in an async, and then you have an await inside your function, an async function. So you'd say async function uh execute promise. Then of course you would await. So the promise result is going to be await my promise. You call my promise there. Then you can console.log the promise result. Then of course, remember that this is a function, even if it's an async function. So async here is to mark that this function is going to be working with a promise inside it. So that when you write await, it will wait for that promise to execute. So if we do that and we come here, there, and then what promise is not a function. So it's saying unhandled rejection. Okay, so I wanted it to actually execute first before we do the unhandled rejection part. So let me clear that out. And it's saying it's even. So you see, we've waited for that promise. If I remove this await and then I try to execute it, it won't wait for the promise. You see, the promise is pending. Then after that, this has already executed. This line, this promise pending you're seeing here is as a result of what we are logging out here. So you see that it didn't wait for the promise to execute before trying to resolve this because we didn't await for the promise. So we need to await for it if we want to log out the results when it's fulfilled. So, but what if this promise rejects? Let me say I change this to 21 now, which is going to reject. How do we, if I try to execute the same promise again, it's going to throw an error, unhandled rejection. How do we do that? The way we can handle that is by wrapping our promise in a try and catch statement. So we want to say, this one we did then and catch, but here is now try and catch. So we'll say we want to try to run this promise, and then when the promise resolves well, resolves, we will run the try, we will finish the try statement. But if at any point the promise rejects, then we will now run the catch statement to catch that unhandled rejection, or to catch the rejection. So we now say console.log reason for rejection. Error. So if you do this and you run NodeScript, you'll see that it tried to run this promise, but since the promise is rejecting because the number is odd, right? It now comes down to talk about the reason for the rejection, or the value for the rejection that was sent back. Do you get? So, but if the promise actually resolved, this catch will not be executed. Rather, the try would be executed. Okay. Now, there might be something that you want to do as soon as, whether your promise resolves or rejects, you just want to do it. For example, if you were designing a login button and you wanted that as soon as the user click on that button, login should change to loading. Even whether it logs in or it doesn't log in, after, like, the button should go back to showing login, not just continue spinning. You might add a finally here. Then the finally will also be a function. So you can say console.log I finally executed. So this finally block of code is going to execute whether or not, whether or not your promise fulfills or rejects. Okay. So that's how you write your finally. Finally that way. Okay. Oh, cancel. Okay, so if we do that and we run this code again, let me clear it and run the code again, you will see that it's odd. So it's odd, and then this is the catch is the one that is being executed. But after that, final is also being executed. Okay. Then if it resolves, let's say we put 20 here, then we clear, then we run it again. After it resolves this promise, it will still print the finally. And this same thing you did here, you can also do it in your denable function. So we have then catch. We also have finally, and finally accepts a function. So the function, you can say console.log I am finally free. Of course. So if we executed that, of course, it's even, and then a finally free is being executed at the end of the day. If it rejects, and finally free is still executed. So, is there any question on that?
I have a question.
Okay.
My
So,
question is that async await, was there still need for the timeout since you said it's going to wait to resolve?
yeah, so the timeout, the reason I put the timeout is just to delay it for some seconds before it executes. I could actually remove it from this timeout. It's not necessary. I just did that to delay it for some times. Okay, so it's not necessary actually. Okay. Is there any other question?
What method is the best method?
Eh?
What method is the best? Is it promise
Any
or the
method is
await?
any method is actually okay. There's no like, oh, this one is a bad method and this one is a good method too. You can use denable functions, you can use try and catch. If you're using, you can use any one actually, basically. But the one that is mostly used is the async await. Okay. Because you're
Yes, sir.
also always going to wrap your function in, or you're going to use your promise in a function most times. You're not just going to write it outside. Okay, and then using async await as helps you avoid what is called the callback hell. So if you're calling like 3 promises, you, instead of nesting the next promise, like writing the next, Okay, so I was saying that it's better to use async and await rather than using the catch. Okay. Okay. So basically, I would demonstrate the callback here in our next class, right? I'll demonstrate that in our next class. So the callback here is just simply having multiple promises, and when you're calling those multiple promises, in order to control the flow of your code, inside your then statement is where you will now consume the next promise. Then maybe if you're using your denable statement, you now write then inside there. Then if there's another promise, you still nest it inside the then statement again. That is going to create what is called a callback here. So we'll do that in our next class. Okay. And let's see. Emmanuel, you're the host. Can you make me the host? Emmanuel. Hello, Emmanuel. Okay, thank you. All right, so that would be all for today.